Hello and welcome to this 36th episode of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad, dedicated to the journals and history written by my great-great-grandfather William Mowbray Scott back in the 1840s. This episode also happens to coincide with Halloween.
Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad.
My name is Ed Hill. So, to kick off, I'd just like to say there's been a little bit of a longer gap than usual between episodes. It's mainly due to the fact that I've been doing various other things. I've also been trying to get the Instagram account up and running a bit better than previously to help promote the podcast, which is still early days, but I'm getting there with it. Obviously, a podcast being a essentially audio medium is something that you have to adapt if you're uploading it onto Instagram, so that's all a bit more involved than usual. But also this 36th episode marks a transition from the first volume of handwritten journals that were written by my great-great-grandfather and the next volume that he started writing in. I could have started this as a new series, if you like, beginning with episode 1, but I decided to continue from the previous 35 episodes because this journal still has to finish his journey in Europe. So I thought that would be a better point to mark a new series. So no doubt there'll be a few more episodes where he's still finishing his trip in Europe before he goes out to Mexico. So let's just explain where we'd got to in the last episode. Basically, William had been continuing his journey with his family back from Italy. If you'll know about the previous episodes, you'll know that he was an engineer in Milan, working on one of the very oldest railways that was built there. And then he'd started his journey back through Europe, coming essentially through Switzerland and then Germany. And he's travelling down the Rhine. And at the last episode, they'd got to Cologne. And that's really where this new episode kicks off, where he starts to explain a bit more about this very historical city, which I hadn't realised quite how historical Cologne is and quite how far back its origins reach until I'd started researching this episode a bit more. If you are tuning in again to the podcast, thanks very much for doing so. And it's great we've got some new listeners, according to the stats, that have been listening. So if you're making your way through all the previous episodes, I hope you are enjoying it. And if you're new to this podcast, it's basically a very simple format. I read bits from the journal and then I stop to talk about those extracts and explain a little bit about what William has written, because it's, pretty old history. Some of it's quite obscure and it certainly needs explaining to me anyway. So hopefully that'll help your understanding of it as well. I don't reference everything that he talks about. I tend to just sort of pick and choose the things that, for whatever reason, inspire me to look into them a bit more. So it's really just my arbitrary choice about that. But anyway, I hope you do enjoy the selections that I make and why I make them. I'll just say the usual things I do at the beginning of each episode about making contact with me. You can do through various means. There's a Twitter account, which is Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour, so you can write any comments and message me there if you want to. There's now this Instagram account as well, and that's Ed's 3G Tour. Now that's EDDS 3G Tour, so Ed's 3G Tour. Or if you look Edward Hill up, you probably see me come up as well. And then there's a Facebook page as well, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. So they're all ways with which you can contact me. Also, just to say the episodes appear on any podcast platform that's out there, really. And they are also on YouTube. But Acast, who host my podcast, have stopped uploading the episodes automatically to YouTube. So I now have to do that myself. But I will be doing that. But again, it does take a little bit of adapting the sound file to make it into a video file for YouTube, but I will be doing that as well each time I post a new episode, so hopefully there'll be continuity there with the 35 that are already on the YouTube channel. Also, just to say, another reason for a little bit of the break is I've been researching about the means of transport which great-great-granddad William was using at the time, and I'm hoping to do a YouTube video about that. It's taken a bit longer than I hoped, what with various other things, so probably kind of hoped to have already posted that up, but it's getting there, so hopefully at some point in the not too distant future there will be some content on the YouTube channel about that. And also there is a video there as well with an interview I did with railway historian Anthony Dawson, which is all about the early railways, because William's very much at the development of the initial railways, so it's very much that era where steam power is just making its mark on the world and railways are beginning to be built all around Europe. So this interview with Anthony really gives some quite interesting insights into the technology that was being invented and developed at that time around steam engines and steam travel. So that's it for this introduction. I do hope you enjoy this episode. It primarily concerns the city of Cologne itself. Funny enough, I don't think, unlike some of the other major cities that he visits, where he does spend some time, like Paris and Milan obviously, I don't get the feeling William spends so much time in Cologne, but he does write an awful lot about it, and he admits that he's researched it a lot when he gets back to London. So that's why really this whole episode is devoted to the city and particularly its very impressive cathedral, which has a very long and interesting past as well. So that really pretty well sums up this episode. I'd say it's Cologne and Cologne Cathedral. I hope you enjoy it. So this part of the second journal begins with the title Recollections of Europe Concluded and a Voyage to the West Indies and Mexico, 1843 to 45, commenced October the 2nd, 1843. And then it's sort of signed off William Scott Zacatecas. And then there's a subheading which says Recollections of the Rhine, Prussia and Belgium. And so it begins. Soon after leaving Bonn, we could perceive the spires and towers of the celebrated city of Cologne, at which we arrived at a little before 5 o'clock. And having got my family safely ensconced in the Hotel Holland, I at once proceeded on a journey of discovery for the remainder of the daylight. Cologne. The fervent admiration with which the Rhine is regarded by Germans is a just tribute to its natural beauties, and still more to the striking events which are associated with this noble river. The vineyards mirrored on its bosom, and all the varied beauties characteristic of the scenery of the Rhine, would not be half so inspiring if its castled crags and ancient towns were not rich to overflowing in the legends of antique romance. Here the old Roman civilization irradiated the darkness of the wild forests, and the more benevolent influences of modern civilization were fostered and developed. Few of the ancient cities of Europe can trace their origins so distinctly as Cologne. It was a Roman station, and subsequently a colonia under the name of Colonia Claudia Agrippintium, from the Emperor Claudius and his wife Agrippina, who was born here, while her father Germanicus commanded in these parts. Agrippina adorned it with the amphitheatre, temples, aqueducts, etc., the ruins of which may still be traced. No spot on the banks of the Rhine exhibits so many Roman vestiges. A great part of the wall which extends along the river is Roman, and also one of the gates. Some of the streets still bear Latin names. Many busts, sarcophagi and stones with the numbers of the legions stationed here have been dug up, and with other relics have been placed in a public museum. It has been doubted whether the Emperor Constantine erected a bridge across the river at this spot. The story is that it was destroyed in the 10th century by Otto the Great, Emperor of Germany, and that the paths are now occasionally visible. Between Cologne and the opposite bank of the river, there is now a bridge, erected in 1822, which rests on 39 pontoons and rises and falls with the water. It is a favoured promenade in fine weather. So I just thought I'd mention here, I've actually managed to find a photograph of this pontoon bridge that stretched across the Rhine, which dates back to 1870. So It was still there quite a few years after William was visiting it in 1842. And it is pretty well as he describes it. The pontoons are very much boat-like in their appearance that the bridge is floating on. And this shot's taken from, you'd say it's from the right bank of the Rhine, looking across, and you can see the cathedral in the background. And just behind it, actually, you can see the edge of what must have been a railway bridge, which is still there now, that must have been built later. The one thing that strikes me about it is that essentially this is a barrier across the Rhine at this point. So any ships or boats wanting to navigate their way up past Cologne at this point would have had to have stopped and unloaded, and then the goods and stuff would have had to be loaded again, or passengers would have had to make their way again to the other side of this bridge to make their way up the Rhine. So it strikes me that the fact they hadn't managed to build a bridge there right up until quite late in the 19th century must have been quite a disadvantage for trade. But I suppose the Rhine at this point is very wide, and perhaps the current is pretty strong here as well. So maybe, just at that time it was impossible with the engineering skills that they had to manage to build a bridge at this point that could have been, passed under or whatever with arches and so forth. There is now what looks like a road bridge approximately in this location where this bridge of boats or pontoon bridge is. But it's quite nice to actually find a picture of this particular thing that Will's mentioned at other points in his journey down the Rhine, that you can get a clear image of what it must have looked like. And I suppose the promenade that he describes it, that fashionable people would have walked across in good weather. Now, at this point, William then goes through a rather lengthy potted history of Cologne, and I'm not going to read it because it's pretty well there in black and white if you want to research it yourself, but things like its links to the Hanseatic League, which was a kind of trading consortium of geographical areas around Cologne, which was very important in the 1200s. As I say, it's quite sort of lengthy. He's basically obviously looked it up in some reference book, so you could do the same now. So I really wanted to concentrate on the sights and sounds as William sees them during his time, rather than going through this bit of history. Of course, sometimes I do include the history it mentions, but in this particular section it's quite long, and I thought it's just a rather lengthy description of the history which you could find anywhere else. So I'll take it up again from this point. Cologne's position to this day is an important central point of the Rhenish trade with the Netherlands, Germany and Switzerland. And at the finishing of the railway line from Aix-la-Chapelle to Liège, it will make it more so, as there will then be a direct road from Ostend to Cologne, thus bringing them between 12 and 14 hours distance. So at this time, William mentions Aix-la-Chapelle. Basically, that's the sort of French name for it. It's more commonly known at the moment in the German, which is Aachen, A-A-C-H-E-N. So when William refers to Aix-la-Chapelle, it's Aachen on the map today. The fame of Cologne and its shrines and relics, which once procured for it the appellation of the Holy City, no longer attract pilgrims from every part of Christendom, and the bones of St Ursula and her 11,000 virgins, and of the 3 magi, or kings of Cologne as they are called, have become objects of curiosity instead of faith and veneration. Cologne extends rather more than 2 miles along the left bank of the Rhine in a semicircular shape, and stretches about a mile inland. It is enclosed by a lofty wall about 6 miles in circuit, with 83 towers rising out of the wall, which is surrounded on the land side by ramparts and deep ditches. Strong redoubts, so that's a word for additional fortifications basically. Strong redoubts have been erected at the principal gates. About a third of the space comprised within the walls consists of the public squares, gardens and vineyards, which once belonged to the religious establishment. The city has a curious antique appearance and is built in a very irregular manner. The streets are narrow, dark, and crooked, and paved with basalt, which is remarkably filthy in its state. The prevailing character of the architecture is Gothic. The principal structures are ecclesiastical. The Church of St Cunibert, a fine building, has an altar like the famous one of St Peter's Church at Rome. The Church of St Peter in Cologne possesses an admirable painting by Rubens, representing the martyrdom of the Apostle Peter, The townhouse of Cologne is a noble building in the Grecian style and has a splendid portico adorned with 2 rows of marble columns. The Jesuits' library, though it has been deprived of many works, still contains 60,000 volumes. Many paintings in the monasteries and churches were carried off or destroyed by the French, but the city, however, still contains some beautiful collections of works of art. Though the number of its towers and spires is not so great as formerly, still they give a rich, varied and imposing aspect to the city when viewed from a distance. One vast pile will not fail to attract the attention. This is the Dom Church or Cathedral. It is unfinished, but its massiveness and the magnificent scale on which it is designed give it a noble and stately character, and even in its present state it is one of the grandest specimens of Gothic architecture. 6 centuries have elapsed since the work was commenced. From 1248 to the end of the 15th century, the builders now resumed and now laid aside their work. The iron crane left on the summit of one of the unfinished towers when the scaffolding was removed, and which had attracted my attention for many miles before I reached the city, was perhaps intended to remind coming generations living in more favourable times that the grand fabric still awaited the last stone of the builder. Wars of politics and religion, usurpations and aggressions, and the bitter fruits which they bear have hitherto left men in no time to complete this temple of Christian peace. But at length the work has now commenced, and I shall now endeavour to enter more fully into the singular history of this edifice, which I have collected with considerable trouble from different quarters. The edifice having interested me so much during my visit to Cologne that after my return to England I seized every opportunity, from the public papers and otherwise, of gathering every information I could obtain on the subject. The cathedral is itself so magnificent and on so large a scale, being 400 feet long and 161 broad, that when contemplating its grandeur as a work of art, we almost forget the shrines and relics which it contains, though some of the former are curious and interesting. The shrine of the 3 kings of Cologne is in a small marble chapel, in the Ionic style, behind the high altar. These kings, as tradition reports, were the magi who came from the east to bring presents to the infant Saviour. The Emperor Frederick Barbarossa brought their bones from Milan after taking that city by storm in 1170. They are placed in a case of solid silver. The skulls, which are the only part that remain, were once crowned with golden diadems. Basically just another crown, really, a word for a crown or headband. Diadems enriched with jewels. Each skull is inscribed with a name written in rubies: Gaspar, Melchior and Balthasar. The shrine of the 3 kings of Cologne was once the most famous in Christendom, and was profusely adorned with precious stones. In 1794 these relics were carried off by the chapter of Arenberg in Westphalia, to prevent their seizure by the French. They were brought back in 1804, but in the meantime a great many of the precious stones had been taken away. Imitations in paste or glass have been substituted, and the crowns of the 3 kings are now silver gilt. There still remains a display of stones, gems, cameos, so they're kind of small carved portraits, and enamel work sufficient to show the former richness of the shrine. Amongst the other objects of interest in the cathedral are the silver coffin of St Engelbert, and some 5 monuments, several splendid painted windows, a beautiful altar table, rich candelabra, curious tapestry, and a singular painting with the date of 1410 representing the patron saint of Cologne. The sacristans, so that's another word for church warders, the sacristans pretend to show one of the bones of St Matthew. Right, I thought I'd break in here just to say a few words about these various shrines and reliquaries that William mentions that are in Cologne Cathedral. I'm going to actually talk about the building of Cologne Cathedral itself a little bit later. But these shrines that he mentions, which are the main draws of pilgrims to Cologne, the principal one is this shrine towards the Magi or the 3 kings. And basically it's a big reliquary, essentially a box in sort of 2 tiers. It's golden in appearance. I think it's apparently silver, but it's gold plated. And on the outside of it, it depicts these various sort of images of the story of the 3 kings. So inside obviously are meant to be the bones of the aforementioned 3 wise men. Of course, there's another term for them. But William, I don't think, would have actually seen this. As he says, this is the first time in the journals that he kind of admits to looking at reference books as things when he talks about getting back to London and learning more about Cologne Cathedral. But yeah, this is this big shrine. Supposedly the skulls of the kings are in there, but who knows? I think they have been examined, but couldn't get a good handle on whether they are there or not. The actual skulls, that is. So its history dates right back to the 1100s. But in 1199, King Otto IV, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, gave to the Archbishop as a gift what were said to be the 3 crowns of the kings as well, which were also meant to be in this shrine as well. So they were a later addition to the shrine. This is one of the most famous things about Cologne, in fact, this shrine, and actually on the city's coat of arms there are 3 gold crowns, so that sort of shows her importance. But it looks like a quite stupendous item, and over the years, as Will mentions in his descriptions, it's been raided, and particularly the jewels have been nicked from it down the years and replaced by various people. So it's been a victim of light-fingered gentlemen down the years. William also mentions St Engelbert. There's another coffin of St Engelbert in Cologne Cathedral. He was a Archbishop of Cologne again back in the... I'll have to look it up when it was. St Engelbert, Archbishop of Cologne, lived from 1185 or 6 to 1225, Anno Domini. But he became quite an important sort of ruler of that area at the time, and I describe him more as a sort of soldier bishop as opposed to just a purely holy bishop. In fact, quite a lot of the statues and pictures and paintings of him depict him with a sword, so he went on a crusade as well at some time he got excommunicated by the Pope, and then as a way of penance he had to go on this crusade, but in the Languedoc region of France. Anyway, to say he's kind of more of a soldier bishop, archbishop, than a purely holy one, but he is venerated, and there are various shrines to him, and indeed his coffin is in Cologne Cathedral. But he was actually apparently killed by his cousin. It's all huge machinations about power and rivalry and all this sort of thing, but apparently in a coach trip going from Cologne to somewhere, or somewhere else to Cologne, with his cousin, who was also some noble bod at the time, he killed him. And there were found to be 47 wounds in his body when he was laid to rest, anyway, in Cologne Cathedral. So I'm just going to also mention another person who is venerated and who attract people to Cologne as pilgrims, and William mentions her, and this is St Ursula. Now, the legend of St Ursula is that her history is vaguely in some way related, that she came from the UK or from Britain somewhere, and she went on some journey to the religious lands, accompanied by 11,000 virgins. Now, the whole thing about this, it's all shrouded in mystery and confusion. Some people think it was only 11 virgins. Some people think it might have been 1,100 virgins. Some people think it was 11,000 virgins. Anyway, William mentions that. He says St Ursula and her 11,000 virgins. Anyway, on this trip overseas, where she was come from the UK, she was accompanied by all these maids, and they were massacred in Cologne by the Huns. And her own death is famously that she was shot by an arrow. So often when she's depicted in art, she's got an arrow in her hand, or there's an arrow nearby. Anyway, just getting back to this basilica that is dedicated to her in Cologne, in it, this big church, is what's called the Golden Chamber. And it's quite a gruesome looking thing, because inside are said to be the bones from the 11,000 virgins that were killed with her, along with her own relics, and also some of them, there's in these sort of ornate golden boxes, there's skulls and things as well of various members of her party who copped it. But the whole thing about St Ursula, to be honest, even amongst the Catholic Church itself, it's sort of questions about the veracity of it all. And certainly amongst these bones, some people, they've actually found bones and said, well, that's not the skull of a person, it's actually the skull of a big dog. So a lot of doubt has been put on this story of St Ursula. But at the time, it was a big draw for pilgrims to Cologne. So you had these two things that William mentions. You had the shrine of St Ursula, or the Basilica of St Ursula, and obviously the shrine of the Magi as well. But he says, they become more a thing of curiosity than veneration, which, I don't know, I mean, it's kind of weird, isn't it? All of these things, after a while, really become more things of curiosity than veneration, I suppose. It's like the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, nearby where I live. I don't know if people actually sort of go on an official pilgrimage to it anymore, but it's certainly one of the tourist attractions of the cathedral. So I suppose that's just the way the world's gone. We're all less holy and we're more moly. We're all less holy and perhaps a bit more secular in total. Anyway, I just thought I'd say those things that William mentions about these shrines in Cologne.
Stem, bone, stem, bone, stem, hurrah, bone, stem, bone, stem, bone, stem, hurrah, bone, stem, bone, stem, bone, stem, hurrah, bones, now hear the word of the Lord.
Yes, Lord! Hallelujah!
Bone, stem, bone, stem, bone, stem, hurrah, bones, now hear the word of the Lord.
But let us return to see the edifice itself. So at this point, William quotes from a number of sources, so I will read them out and explain a little about them as we go along. The first person that he quotes is, I think, someone called Karl Vogt, V-O-G-T, who was a German politician and a scientist, but he'd obviously written about Cologne Cathedral. An accurate writer on Rhenish history gives the following account of the original design. It was, he says, designed to form a Latin cross, the lengths of which, from east to west, should be 400 feet. Over the intersection of the arms of this cross, it was contemplated to erect a cupola, it's a dome, of the largest possible size. At the western extremity, there was to have been 2 enormous towers of 5 stories high, the several stories to be supported upon curious pillars, and the towers to be surmounted with painted spires of finely carved fretwork. The lower story of each hall was designed to form an antehall or porch to the 2 main entrances of the church. At the lateral extremities of the cross, in the northern and southern sides of the building, there were also to be 2 grand entrances. 460 ponderous pillars arranged in double rows from west to east were destined to support the immense roof, and an equal number of pilasters to correspond with them were to be inserted in the sides of the walls of this transcendent edifice. Each pillar was to be of different design to its fellow, and no one of the pilasters was to be of the same form as the other. So this is now William speaking. The projector of the noble structure was Engelbert the Holy. He was Archbishop of Cologne and also Count of Berg in his own right in 1220. The edifice was commenced in 1248. It is singular that the name of the architect is altogether unknown, and fanciful legends have been related to the account for this unusual circumstance. They may be seen in Mr. Snow's book, Legends of the Rhine. Merian, an old local historian of Cologne, so I can't actually find a reference to this Merian person, but it's obviously someone else who William decides to quote, mentions the plan adopted for the completion of the building. He says, "It was made a custom of the state that every new archbishop should add a portion of the original design to that which had already been erected before him, to the end that in the course of years the whole edifice might be completed. And this good custom was long complied with, but in the end fell into disuse, owing to the local troubles which first broke out between the archbishops and the citizens, and then the troubles which affected Germany in general up to the period of the Reformation. Thus, this noble monument of religion and of art still remains in an unfinished condition." So that's the end of this quote, and then another quote from someone called Schreiber describes its recent state as, "The 2 towers, which were intended to be 500 feet high, remained unfinished. The northern one is not more than 24 feet above the ground, and is little more than half the height it was intended to be. Only the chain of the church and the chapels surrounding it have been finished. The columns in the nave of the church terminate at a ceiling composed of simple planks covered with slates." William quoting another person now. "That competent critic, the late Mr. Hope, author of the History of Architecture, speaking of the unfinished choir, which is 180 feet high, says it resembles a splendid vision. He says, "From its size, height, and disposition of pillars, arches, and beautiful coloured windows, to the double range of stupendous flying buttresses, and of intervening piers, bristling with a forest of ornamented pinnacles, these strike the beholder with awe and astonishment." He adds that this edifice, if completed, would have been at once the most regular and most stupendous Gothic monument existing, or as the author of one of Mr. Murray's handbooks for tourists says, the St Peter's of Gothic architecture. So I'll just go back those last two quotations. So Thomas Hope, he wrote a history of architecture which was published in 1835. And the guidebooks that he mentions were written by or published by John Murray. And these were popular with travellers at this time. And they later became known as the Blue Guides. So they were kind of like an equivalent of what would be a rough guide to book that we would buy today before we travel somewhere to get an idea of what it's like. So these John Murray's Blue Guides were the precursor or origins of the well-known travel guidebooks that we know today. Anyway, this is William again talking about Cologne Cathedral. Many princes have sought at various periods to complete the building of the cathedral, but the work was too great for the times in which they lived, and still it remained in a condition between a fragment and a ruin, baffling the desires of those who wished to see the last stone finished of so grand a monument of man's intellect and industry. For many years the late King of Prussia advanced large sums towards the repair and maintenance of the choir. To his son, the present king, he has devolved the more gratifying duty of commencing in earnest the completion of the entire design. The first stone of the new works for finishing the structure was laid by him with much ceremony on the 4th of September 1842, and all Germany has taken an interest equally enlightened in this great object. The King of Prussia has pledged himself to supply a large annual sum for this purpose. Other princes have followed his example, and private subscriptions have been raised to aid the undertaking, not only in Germany, but in other parts of the continent. The architect M. Schwerner, so this was Ernst Friedrich Schwerner, and indeed he was employed then at that time to manage the completion of Cologne Cathedral. Anyway, the architect M. Schwerner calculates that a sum equal to £720,000 will be required, and the work will occupy about 30 years. Let us hope that no new outburst, either of civil faction or foreign hostility, will once more cause the builders to suspend their labours. Okay, I'm going to stop now to just say a little bit about Cologne Cathedral, because it is a remarkable building, and when William was observing it in 1842, it was still under construction. It took more than 630 years to build. So it had originally been started, I think, in 1248, and it was not until 1880 that it was finally completed. And William mentions this enormous crane that was on top of one of the towers that was still under construction when he saw it. That wooden crane was actually a medieval crane that had been there itself for 400 years. Pretty well by the time William saw it. So it is just an incredible length of time that it took to build. And it was due to various halts in construction due to wars and politics and things like that, really. But basically, pretty well around William's time seeing it was when the last phase of construction began, because the foundation stone for the works beginning again was laid by the King of Prussia, who was Frederick IV, I think. And indeed, he'd agreed to these plans by this architect Schwerner to complete the building. And they pretty well did it to the original medieval plans, although they did use some more modern materials behind the facade, such as iron beams and things like that. It's still a remarkable building to this day. It's apparently Germany's most visited landmark. 6 million people go and see it each year. When it was built, it was pretty well the tallest building in the world, I think, until the Washington Monument was built and completed a few years later. And I think it's said it's still the third tallest church in the world. Its two towers are about 515 feet tall, so it is immense. Although, funny enough, the tower that actually is ever so slightly taller than that is the church in Ulm, which I think I mentioned earlier, which is another church in Germany. But that just has a single tower, but it is tiny bit taller than the two twin towers of Cologne Cathedral. In a way, you could say its history has been quite varied its entire lifetime ever since construction began, because after it was completed in 1880, it was only ever without scaffolding for about 4 years, because then remedial work started to have to be done because the stonework was deteriorating with the wear caused due to wind and rain. And it's said that basically it's unlikely it'll ever be seen without some sort of form of scaffolding around it, because the stones that they used down the years were fairly friable and prone to wear. And acid rain as well was another issue. So it's still being maintained now. And as William mentions, actually, it was mostly paid for by private donations. A society was set up that still exists today that was created to gather public donations to fund the finishing of the work of the cathedral. About a third of it was supplied by the Prussian state as well, but indeed the society that was created is still in charge of funding the repairs to it today. And I think it said that's the sort of oldest type of that association in the world. I mean, of course, cathedrals do take a long time to build. When I first read about this, it sort of reminded me, of course, about the famous one in Barcelona, the Gaudi Cathedral, Sagrada Familia. I mean, that's relatively short build time. It's still being built now, but I think work on that started in about 1882 and it's still going on now. I think the latest forecast is it will be completely finished in 2034, and that's with much more modern building techniques and methods as well. But just think it's interesting that William saw it pretty well just at this time when the final restoration works were beginning. The last thing I thought I'd mention about it is one of the bells in the tower. I think it's in the south tower, the belfry tower. When that was cast in 1923, that at that time was the largest free swinging bell anywhere in the world. I think there's one bigger now in Bucharest, in Romania somewhere, but at the time it was cast. And that has the name, well, its official name is Petersgloch, St Petersgloch bell, but its sort of nickname is called Dick Peter, which is translated means sort of like Fat Peter, basically. But I saw some footage of it ringing, and of course it has the clapper thing in the middle that swings to and fro, which itself is enormous. I mean, the bell weighs about 24 tons. I think the clapper thing must weigh a good couple of tons, 2 or 3, maybe 6 tons. Anyway, not that long ago, because of wear, it actually dropped out of the bell and smashed through the roof and everything down into the nave below, but it's now been replaced with a new swinging clapper thing. It's only rung on various occasions during the year, either very significant moments. So I think at the end of the Second World War was one time when it was rung, but then the rest of the year it's only rung about, I think, less than 20 times a year on various Catholic feast days and saint days and stuff. But yeah, that's Fat Peter the bell that can be heard if you're there at the right day, being rung and resounding round Cologne. And indeed, Cologne Cathedral, I think the only building that's taller than it in Cologne itself is the telecommunications tower, and in recent years they've passed laws that no other buildings nearby can be built that will in any way rival it in terms of height, so it's always going to sort of remain as this very prominent landmark in the city. It was quite badly bombed during the Second World War, partly because it was such a prominent landmark. It became quite a good navigation point for the Allied bombers to use when they were flying over Germany. And in fact, there was a bit of one of the towers that got badly damaged in the Second World War and was temporarily bricked up. And I think it was only in 2005 they decided finally that they would replace this brickwork with stonework to make it look more like the rest of the building. And in fact, some people were against it. They thought they should leave it as a sort of monument to the destruction of the Second World War that had happened. But eventually the city bigwigs or big cheeses decided that they would construct this stonework that I think it basically covers the brickwork rather than, it hasn't actually kind of replaced it structurally, but there's a kind of stone facade in front of it now. But the Cologne Cathedral is a remarkable building, but due to its construction of friable stone work, which is a nice word, isn't it? Friable. In my stonemasonry days, I would have said easily weathered stone. It looks like there's always going to be some form of scaffolding around it somewhere. Rome, magnificent Rome, wherever the traveller wends, the traces of thy dominion greet his eyes. Still in the heart of the bold German race is graven the print of the eagle's claw, and amidst the haunted regions of the Rhine we pause to wonder at the great monuments of the Italian yoke. So when he says yoke, that's another word for oppression, but rule. So basically, when he says the Italians rule this area, but obviously he means the Romans. Then gives this rather grand farewell to the city of Cologne. Farewell then to the city to which the camp of Marcus Agrippa gave birth, the spot which had resounded with the armed trade of the legions of Trajan. Then to the city in which Vitellius and Silvanus were proclaimed emperors. But ere we go, let us pause to take a last look at the church of St Maria. So this is St Maria im Capitol, near to which the latter met his death. The church of St Maria occupies the site of the Roman capital, and the place retains the Roman name. Let us pause for a moment, ere we to enter the church. What recollections crowd upon the mind? On the site of the Roman capital, a Christian church and a convent erected, and by whom? The mother of Charles Martel, the conqueror of the Saracen, the arch-hero of Christendom itself. And to these scenes and calm retreat, to the cloisters of the convent, once belonging to this church, fled the bruised spirit of a royal sufferer, the wife of Henry IV, the victim of Richelieu, the unfortunate Mary Medici. Alas, the cell and the convent are but a vain emblem of that desire to fly to God, which belongs to distress. The solitude soothes, but the monotony recalls regret. And from my own part, I never saw in my frequent tours through Catholic countries the still walls in which a monastic vanity hoped to shut out the world. But a melancholy came over me. What hearts at war with themselves, what unceasing regrets, what pinings after the past, what long and beautiful years devoted to a moral grave by a momentary rashness, an impulse, a disappointment. But in these churches the lesson is more impassive and less sad. The weary heart has ceased to ache, the burning pulses are still, the troubled spirit has flown to the only rest which is not a deceit. Power and love, and hope and fear, avarice, ambition, they are quenched at last. Death is the only monastery, the tomb is the only cell, and the grave that adjoins the convent is the bitterest mock of its futility. Cologne is 32 leagues northwest of Frankfurt, population 55,000. Right, as William waxes lyrical here about the history of Cologne, I just thought I'd briefly try and explain some of these references that he's making here, rather grandly. As he's metaphorically, if you like, leaving Cologne, he mentions this church, St Maria. Now, this church's full name is St Maria im Capitol, and I think he chooses it because it's a Romanesque church that's history dates back really, really far, right back to Roman times, or its origins are back to Roman times. So I suppose it makes sense in his mind to choose this church as kind of metaphorical vessel in which to try and encapsulate the immense and long history of Cologne. And the two people that he mainly references there, Charles Martel and Maria Medici. Charles Martel, he was basically a leader of the Franks way back in medieval times. His sort of nickname is the Hammer, because he was a very successful military leader of the Franks back in the late 600s. So we're going way back. And his mum, indeed, Plectrude, she had this church, or the beginnings of this church were built on a Roman church site here at that time. So I suppose that's why he references it. you can look up Charles Martel and it'll tell you his long history in ruling this area as a successful leader of the Franks way back in those times. And then the next person that he references is Marie de Medici. Now, she was the wife of Henry IV. I don't know if you remember in a previous podcast when William was walking around Paris and we discussed Henry IV there. He was known as Good King Henry IV, and his rule is often looked upon favourably in the kind of history of France. You know, he was considered a good king. Anyway, when he died, Mary Medici, or Mary de Medici, she became regent because their son, Louis XIII, wasn't old enough to actually take up the throne at that time. Now, as her name suggests, she was actually Italian, and Henry IV basically married her for her money. But anyway, after he died, and there was always this suspicion that she had something to do with his death and his assassination, she took power as regent, and she's kind of well known for her political machinations in the court. Also, because she was Italian, it said that she was never really trusted by the French, and apparently she never learned to speak French very well either. Anyway, there's all sorts of political and royal struggles in her lifetime. A little bit like Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots, you know, that kind of thing going on. To sum up, near the end of her time as regent, she essentially fell out with her son when he came to power. He obviously wanted to take power for himself, and he was aided by Cardinal Richelieu, so that's why William mentions Cardinal Richelieu. Anyway, there was this struggle between them two, and it actually led to battles and things, and it was called the War of the Mother and Son. But eventually, through various Machiavellian shenanigans, Richelieu got her banished to Cologne. So she ended up in Cologne, and that's where she dies. I don't know if she actually dies in this church or spent any time in this church, but anyway, she fled there and died. This was all in around about the 1600s, I think. So I suppose perhaps William chooses these two quite prominent people separated by a long distance of time to, in some way, wax lyrical about the history of Cologne. It's one of those moments where William does this thing. He did it in Paris as well, where he starts writing about this stuff. And there's a sort of assumption in his text that you kind of know these references that he's making. And, you know, I think even back in 1840, however well educated they may have been and learned, to kind of make a brief passing reference to these people, if you've got no idea who they are, and expect the reader to kind of understand what you're going on about. This struck me as always a little bit odd, and something that he does from time to time, and this is another example of it. He kind of thinks, I'm going to sum up history in a very poetic way, so I'll make these references to people, but then you need to you would have needed to get an encyclopedia out at that time to understand what he was talking about, and in these days, of course, I have to go on the internet to comprehend what on earth he's yapping on about. And of course, in the journals, there's no notes. You know, you get that thing where you put an asterisk against something and then there's a note below the page. You know, you used to have that in your English literature study aids when you were studying A-levels at school. I mean, of course, I suppose Shakespeare did it as well. You have to look up what they're talking about, don't they? But anyway, this is one occasion where I think he gets the idea that he's going to really sum up his feelings about somewhere. And I think it kind of gets a bit carried away and forgets that I don't really necessarily know who Charles Martel was. I suppose this comes down to age and things, really, doesn't it? And these things are distant memories in the past, but they were very distant in his day. You get this sometimes now when you meet people younger than yourself, so you're saying you might refer to a film star, and they always say the thing, oh, it's a bit before my time. Which I've got to say I do find quite irritating, because, you know, I might refer to someone like, I don't know, James Stewart or John Wayne. You know, Judy Garland. What? A bit before my time. Yeah, it's a bit before my blooming time as well. How old do you think I am? I still know who they are. That's my little rant about young people's attitude to even fairly contemporary history sometimes. I've got to say, my 7-year-old daughter said to me the other day, were you in the war, Dad? No, I was not. I know I've got grey hairs, but, you know, blimey. Right, I'm going to finish the episode here with William giving those final statistics about Cologne and then waxing lyrical about its great history and past. I've quite enjoyed this episode. As I mentioned during it, I didn't really know much about Cologne, so it's actually been quite an enlightening opportunity for me while doing the research to learn more about it, and has made me think that maybe I should visit there sometime. So just to move on and say a little bit about the next episode, William will continue his journey on his way to Ostend, because that's where they're going to get their paddle steamer back to London from. And they make their way to what he calls La Chapelle. And as I said earlier, La Chapelle is the French name for Aachen. So it seems that at that time, for whatever reason, the French name seemed to be the one that was more in use than the German one, which seems a bit surprising because at that time, I think that area was under the rule of the Prussian government. And obviously you'd have thought the German name would have been perhaps a more prominent one, but this is a case a bit like earlier in the podcast when William was in the Alps area, and of course there's so many countries in close proximity with one another and all with different names for basically the same place. It did make it quite hard at times to locate where he was talking about and where he was travelling to and from. Anyway, that's the end of episode 36. It's nice to have been recording again. And just to say, as I said at the beginning, you can contact me through those ways of the Instagram account, which is EDS3G Tour, which is EDDS number 3G Tour, or the Twitter, which is Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour, or the Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. So by all means, do make contact by any of those ways if you wish, and it's always good to get a little bit of feedback about the podcast. So that's it. Just to say, if you have been, thanks for listening.